By the time the sun should have risen over the Gulf, there was no morning, only water, not waves in the poetic sense, but a wall, not an ocean you contemplate, but a machine that had finally decided to take back the land. The island city had spent years telling itself that it was too important to be erased. A storm would test that idea in ways no one there could have imagined. In the summer of 1900, Galveston, Texas, was the glittering port of the Gulf, an 8-mile-long barrier island barely 8 feet above sea level at its highest point. The ocean read that line differently. In early September, the Gulf warmed under a breathless heat. Barometers fell so slowly that most people shrugged it off. Surf began to nibble at the beach, then eat at it, then heave across it. By the morning of September 8th, the tide was already higher than anyone could remember. Streetcars still clanged, children tugged mothers' sleeves for penny candy, and dock workers eyed a dark horizon that looked not like weather, but like something alive. They were not wrong. What followed is not a storm story with a happy ending. Viewer discretion is advised. Galveston's first mistake was pride. Its second was geography. Barrier islands are walls only in name. They are, in truth, living sandbars, thin, migratory, and made to be rearranged by longshore currents and storms. Galveston had paved its dune line, built grand hotels on its foredune, and stretched neighborhoods toward the open Gulf. It was a city balanced on a door left ajar, and the wind had found the handle. Warnings were vague. The Weather Bureau tracked a system that had crossed Cuba and slipped into the Gulf, but 1900s meteorology ran on telegraphs, ship logs, and luck. Havana's experienced forecasters, bruised by politics and sidelined by Washington, had used the word hurricane. The official bulletin said, tropical storm moving northwest. On the morning of the 8th, the telegraph wires humming out of Galveston began to snap, one after another like banjo strings as surf gnawed at their poles. The city was drifting out of conversation with the mainland at the very moment it most needed to talk. Neighbors noticed new things. Chickens roosted at noon. Windows breathed inward. The Gulf's surface turned the color of steel shavings and carried a taste of mud. Isaac Klein rode a horse down to the beach and saw the tide pushing ash across the line of dunes. He sent a warning to evacuate low areas, but where on an island 8 feet high is low? By late afternoon, wagons rolled west toward San Luis Pass. Others crowded the Tremont Hotel, believing its massive brick would outlast any wind. Families tied valuables into bed sheets and dragged them upstairs. No one could drag the ground floor higher. The third mistake was the calendar. Early September is the Gulf's killing hour. Water's a bathtub warm, and the vertical engine that drives storm cores has everything it wants. Offshore, the central pressure dropped, the wind field grew radial arms, and the storm's right front quadrant began lining itself up with Galveston's seaward edge. Surge does not argue with maps. It simply visits the flattest places first. At dusk, the wind became a voice. Shingles flew like knifed cards. Whole porches dislocated and sailed down avenues like jury-rigged rafts. On Broadway, oaks leaned together in a cathedral of stress and snapped one by one, each fracture masked by the roar of water that now moved with intent through the first floors of homes. In kitchens, lamps hissed and died, and the world reduced to sound and feel. The muscular push at the knees, the cold shock against the ribs, the unexplained thud as a neighbor's roof found your staircase. Surge is not a normal flood. Rain fills, surge strikes. It arrived first as trespass and then as rule. Houses slid off piers and bumped down streets, still lit inside for a moment, like lanterns set adrift. Fences became spears, windows became mouths. Families retreated as far up as they could go, to second floors, to attics, to roofs. Those who had axes carried them high, those who did not learned why they should have. At St. Mary's Orphanage on the western beach, 2 sisters gathered more than 90 children. There were no good decisions left. The sisters threaded clothesline through tiny belts and sleeves and tied children to their waists in groups, praying that weight could become salvation. The building trembled, groaned, and stepped into the flood as if it too were made of breath and bone. When it broke, those ropes turned into umbilicals, some to life, many to the sea. Survivors would later recall the sound the wind made over that empty place, a keening that did not stop even when the storm did. Isaac Klein and his family moved to the second floor and then the roof as their house tried to float. He would later remember seeing a procession of homes, each transfigured into a raft of furniture and grief, colliding, tilting, tearing open to reveal parlor pianos and framed portraits tumbling into the black. It is one thing to picture the ocean rising. It is another to feel your city unbuilt in your hands. By midnight the island was many islands. The causeway to the mainland had gone under. The last telegraph wire lay dead. People shouted their names into wind that amputated syllables. Dogs swam in place and then did not. Men tied themselves to beams and felt the beams move like animals. The ocean, having breached, began to rearrange. The morning after looked less like a city and more like a lumber yard after an explosion. Where streets had been, there were beached hulls of homes. Where gardens had been, there were clothes tangled in live oak branches. The air smelled of salt, creosote, and something you do not put into sentences. Those who had survived climbed down from roofs into a world with new rules. Find water, find shelter, find people whose names you knew. A locomotive inched across the damaged trestle, bringing the first rescuers. A flat car loaded with doctors and men carrying shovels followed. The line would hold only intermittently, because the bay had decided that tracks belonged to it now. Across the island, volunteers began a count that could never be exact. Bodies lay where the surge set them, beneath staircases that no longer led anywhere, against fences uprooted and relocated blocks away, under collapsed galleries that had spelled comfort yesterday. By some estimates, more than 6,000 died on the island and several thousand more on the mainland coast, America's deadliest natural disaster. Numbers are scaffolds on which we hang the uncountable. There were logistics you do not rehearse. Cold storage was gone, the ground was saturated, the weather stayed hot. The city ordered mass burials. Then when shallow graves surged back open, they burned the dead at the shoreline using debris for fuel. It was the only way to keep disease from taking the rest. Men on detail had handkerchiefs tied across faces and a 1,000-yard stare that would not leave them for years. Still the living set to work. Kitchens appeared in the lee of intact walls. A line formed at the well that still gave sweet water. Someone chalked the word hope on its brick. Women organized lists. Who has a needle? Who has a baby? Who last saw the Thompsons? Who can write a letter to a mother in Ohio? Children found dishes, pictures, one shoe, a doll. Relief trains arrived with lumber and lime. Telephones returned to a few blocks. A committee called itself a government and began talking about the only practical question left. How do you keep the ocean out when it had proven it could walk in whenever it wished? The answer would become legendary. They would build a seawall, 17 feet high, curving to throw waves back on themselves, and they would raise the city, block by block, house by house, pouring sand under structures cranked skyward on screw jacks. Churches rose on temporary forests of timber. Streets climbed a story. Front steps suddenly met mid-air and then, months later, met the ground again. Galveston decided, with the stubbornness of grief, that it would not be erased, that man could thicken a sandbar and teach the sea new habits. The 1900 hurricane taught 3 lessons that coastal cities still mispronounce. The first is about language. People do not respond to wind speed the way they respond to water depth in your living room. In Galveston, residents had watched wind before. Few had been taught to imagine surge. Today we still fixate on categories, 2, 3, 4, 5, as if the Saffir-Simpson scale were a spell. Surge is geometry plus momentum. If you live at elevation X on topography Y with shelf bathymetry Z, then the number you should care about is how high water will stand where your children sleep. Meteorology has gotten exquisitely good at storm track and intensity. Communicating what that means on a particular street remains an art. The second lesson is about memory. The farther we get from disaster, the more we landscape over it. In Galveston before 1900, a respected forecaster could call a catastrophic strike absurd and be applauded. Afterward, the city measured heroism in wheelbarrow loads. Then, as decades passed, tourists came for the Strand, and for winter sun, and for the novelty of a wall that had made defiance visible in concrete. Memory becomes tourism. Tourism becomes tax revenue. Revenue becomes development at the edge that looks a lot like the edge that failed. The ocean waits. It does not forgive, but it does forget nothing. The third lesson is grimmer. Sometimes the fix works, and sometimes you only move risk around the corner. The seawall saved Galveston many times. Raising the grade turned a sandbar into a platform, but barriers bounce energy elsewhere. Communities west of the wall found themselves newly vulnerable to currents bent by civil engineering. Modern cities build surge gates across harbors and reclaim marshes to give rivers new rooms to overflow. These are good ideas. They are also ideas with budgets, maintenance schedules, and political lifespans shorter than the oceans. And yet, the story you're hearing is not only about a city punished for arrogance, it's also about ordinary people performing acts of indistinguishable grace. A man gave his boots to a stranger and waded barefoot through splintered glass. A woman stitched her neighbor's scalp with fishing line. Teenagers formed a chain across a wash of current so an old couple could cross. A boy found a piano key in the sand and called it a tooth from the sea. The dead lay beyond numbers. The living built rituals to carry their names. Years later, on mornings when the Gulf was glassy and the air thick with salt, Galveston residents said you could still feel the shape of that night in the way the wind bent around corners. The city never returned to its preeminence as the state's premier port. That crown migrated to Houston with the Houston Ship Channel, but Galveston AS will hardened into infrastructure and story. Children in schools learned why the wall curves. Tour guides pointed at mansions not for their decor, but for the chalk marks hidden in basements that once were attics. Every hurricane season, the island holds its breath in a practiced way. The title you read at the top is not metaphor. The ocean did devour a city, chewed it, changed it, and spit it back up rearranged. The people who lived there learned to build with that knowledge, not against it. If there is a moral, it is not that nature always wins. It is that nature always plays the long game, and the only winning move is to remember.